What would you do if the only thing you could afford was a place everyone else had already given up on? Not a home, not even a shelter, a ruin. 4 crumbling walls on a ridge so high and so wind-beaten that the locals had a name for it. They called it the dead man's grave. She paid $50. Every last cent she had in this world. $50 for 16 acres of rock, a collapsed roof, and a chimney stack standing alone against the sky like a headstone. The clerk in the land office smiled when he took her money. The men outside the saloon laughed out loud. The richest man in the valley offered her $5 to walk away and save herself the embarrassment. They all saw the same thing. A broke widow buying a ghost. But here is what none of them knew. Buried under 30 years of neglect, hidden inside the walls and beneath the frozen ground of that so-called worthless ruin, was a secret. A dead man's life work. A discovery so valuable that someone had once killed to keep it buried. And the only person patient enough to listen to the stones, the only one desperate enough to dig with her bare hands in the dead of winter, was the woman they had already written off. This is the story of Maren Hale and the forgotten ruin on Silent Ridge. Stay close now. Find a quiet place to settle in, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. The night Dougal died, the wind smelled like wheat. That was the thing Maren could never shake loose from her memory. Not the fever, not the way his skin burned so hot she could feel the heat rising off him from 2 feet away. Not even the sound of his breathing at the end, that awful wet rattle like something broken deep inside his chest, trying to claw its way out. No, it was the smell, golden and sweet. The late summer wheat they had planted together that spring, standing tall and heavy in the fields outside the window, ready for harvest. The smell of everything they had built. The smell of the future they were supposed to have. And it came drifting in through the open window on a warm Kansas breeze, while the man she loved was dying in her arms. She was 28 years old. They had been married for 6 years. 6 years of hard soil and harder winters, and the kind of quiet happiness that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in small things. The way he left the last piece of bread for her without saying a word. The way she sang while she hung the laundry and he stood in the barn doorway pretending not to listen. The way they sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sun melt into the flatland, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. They had come west together from the valley town of Harrow Falls in Montana, following a rumor of richer soil and cheaper land. And the rumor had been true. The soil was black and deep. The wheat grew thick. For a few years, it felt like they had outrun every hard thing that had ever chased them. Then the fever came. It swept through the homesteads that summer like a brush fire, invisible and merciless. It took the Granger family first, all 5 of them inside a week. Then old Emmett Sayers, then the Colton twins. By the time it reached their door, Marin already knew what it was. She had seen enough of its work to recognize the flush, the trembling, the sweat that wouldn't stop. Wet.
Dougal fought it for 9 days. He was a strong man, thick-shouldered and stubborn, the kind of man who could split a cord of wood before breakfast and still whistle while he did it. But the fever didn't care about strength. It ate through him the way fire eats through dry pine, steady and sure and unstoppable. On the 9th night,
he opened his eyes. They were clear for the first time in days, and Marin felt a surge of desperate hope. Maybe the fever had broken. Maybe the worst was past. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw it in his eyes. Not recovery, recognition. He knew what was happening. He had made his peace with it before she had.
He reached for her hand. His grip was so weak she barely felt it. She leaned close, pressing her forehead against his, feeling the furnace heat of his skin. "Don't go back to the valley," he whispered. His voice was a dry scrape, barely there. "Don't let the dirt bury you too." She didn't understand what he meant. Not then. She thought it was the fever talking, the rambling of a mind unmoored by days of burning. She squeezed his hand and told him to rest. She told him they would harvest the wheat in the morning. She told him lies because the truth was too heavy to hold. He closed his eyes. The wind brought another wave of that sweet wheat smell through the window. And sometime before dawn, so quietly she almost missed it, Dougal Hale stopped breathing. She buried him under the cottonwood tree at the edge of their property. She dug the grave herself because there was no one left to help. The neighbors who survived the fever were too weak or too afraid to come close. She wrapped him in the quilt her mother had made, the one with the blue star pattern, and she lowered him into the Kansas dirt that had promised them everything and delivered this. She didn't cry, not then. The tears were somewhere inside her, but they had frozen solid, locked behind a wall of shock so thick she couldn't reach them. She stood over the fresh mound of earth with the shovel still in her hands, the wheat field rustling behind her like a crowd of witnesses, and she felt nothing, absolutely nothing. As if the fever had burned through her too and left only a hollow space where a woman used to be. She sold the homestead for what she could get. The wheat, the tools, the furniture they had built together. All of it converted into a small stack of worn bills that she counted and recounted in the empty house. When it was done, she had enough for a train ticket east and the purchase of an old sway-backed mule from a trader who was probably cheating her and didn't care enough to hide it. The mule's name was Solomon. He was the color of dust,
with long ears and dark, patient eyes that looked like they had already seen every sad thing the world had to offer and had decided to keep going anyway. When Marin put her hand on his neck for the first time, he let out a long, slow breath through his nostrils. Not a greeting, more like an acknowledgement. One tired creature recognizing another.
She left Kansas on a Tuesday morning without looking back. The wheat was still standing in the field, unharvested. It would rot where it stood. She couldn't bring herself to cut it. That wheat was the last thing Dougal had planted, and harvesting it felt like erasing his handwriting from the earth. The train carried her east and then north, through plains and river towns and stations whose names she didn't bother to read. She sat by the window and watched the country scroll past like a painting she had no part in. At Billings, she left the train and began the long, slow journey south by wagon road into the valley she had left a decade ago. She didn't want to go back. Dougal had told her not to. But she had nowhere else. Her parents were dead, buried in the churchyard at the edge of town. She had no siblings, no cousins, no one waiting. The valley was not a homecoming. It was the last place left. Harrow Falls sat in a cradle of mountains in western Montana, a town of maybe 300 souls strung along a single main street of packed dirt. It hadn't changed. The same false-fronted buildings, the same boardwalks warped by weather, the same mercantile with its faded awning, and the same saloon with its swinging doors. Marin drove Solomon and the borrowed wagon down that street on a late September afternoon, the dust rising in small clouds around the wheels. She felt the eyes before she saw them, faces in doorways, curtains pulled aside. A woman pausing mid-sweep on the boardwalk to stare. They recognized her. Of course they did. In a town this size, everyone knew everyone, and everyone remembered the young bride who had ridden out 10 years ago with a strong husband and bright eyes and a future. Now they saw what had come back. A thin woman in a worn dress, driving a mule that looked like it had given up on life. No husband beside her. No wagon full of belongings. Just dust and silence and the absence of everything she had left with. She could read their faces the way you read weather. Pity. Curiosity. A faint, uncomfortable relief that her bad luck was not their own. The whispers started before she reached the livery. That's the Vance girl, isn't it? Hale, I mean. Married that big fellow, Dougal. Heard the fever got him, out in Kansas. Back with nothing, looks like. Shame. Marin kept her eyes forward. She fixed her gaze on the mountains, the raw blue line of peaks that walled in the valley to the north. They were the only thing that felt like home. Not the town. Not the people. The mountains. They didn't whisper. They didn't judge. They just stood there, ancient and indifferent, and for a moment
That indifference felt like the kindest thing anyone had offered her. The livery was at the far end of the street, a big weathered barn with a corral out back and the smell of hay and horse sweat drifting through the open doors. Jedediah Dunn stood in the doorway, a pitchfork in one hand and a rag in the other. He was in his late 60s, a man built from leather and wire, his face so deeply lined by sun and wind that it looked like a topographic map of the valley itself. He had been her father's closest friend, and he was the only person in this town Maren trusted. He saw her coming from 100 yards out. She watched his face change. The easy squint of a man looking into the afternoon light shifted into something softer, something that held sorrow and recognition, and a kindness so quiet it almost hurt more than the pity. He set down the pitchfork and walked out to meet her. He took Solomon's reins without a word, running a practiced hand along the mule's neck. Solomon leaned into the touch, the first sign of ease the animal had shown in days.
Heard you were coming back, Maren.
Jedediah's voice was low and rough, like gravel at the bottom of a creek bed. Heard about Dougal. I'm sorry for it.
She nodded. The knot in her throat was so tight she couldn't speak around it. She had practiced words on the long ride here, things to say, explanations to give. But now, standing in front of someone who had known her father, who had held her as a baby, who had watched her grow up and leave, and now watched her return in ruin, the words wouldn't come. You need a place to stay, he asked, already knowing the answer. I need a place to own. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw from days of disuse. Something small, something mine. Jedediah wiped his hands on the rag, his gaze lifting toward the high ridges to the north. The late light caught the granite faces up there, turning them the color of old bone. Not much left that's small, he said carefully. Garrett Thornwall's bought up most everything in the lowlands, been consolidating for years, owns half the valley now. Thornwall. The name landed in the air like a dropped stone. Maren remembered him, a boy a few years older than her, loud and thick-necked, always pushing smaller kids out of his way, always taking the biggest piece, always standing too close. His father had been the same. Money and meanness passed down like an inheritance. What about higher up? She asked. On the ridges? Jedediah frowned. Nothing up there but rock and wind, and the old Lockhart place, I suppose, though you can't call it a place anymore. More like a pile of stones. He paused, something shifting behind his eyes. They call it the dead man's grave now. Been sitting empty near on 27 years. Nobody's wanted it. A memory surfaced, faint and gray, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Her father, pointing up at a distant chimney stack on the high ridge, telling her a story about a strange old man who lived up there alone, a man who talked to plants and rocks and the wind itself. The neighbors thought he was mad. Her father, she remembered, had not been so sure. A scientist, her father had said. his voice thoughtful. Or a fool, sometimes hard to tell the difference. A place no one wanted, a place forgotten, a ruin on a ridge where the wind never stopped. It sounded like her. "Is it for sale?" she asked. Jedediah looked at her, not a glance, but a long, searching look, the kind that goes past the surface and reads what's underneath. He saw the exhaustion. He saw the grief. But somewhere beneath all of it, buried deep like ore in rock, he saw something else. A hardness that had not been there before. A resolve that was not hope, not yet, but something close to its shadow. She was not looking for comfort. She was looking for ground to stand on, even if that ground was stone. "Deeds at the land office," he said quietly. "Been sitting there for decades. County holds it for back taxes. Costs next to nothing." He hesitated. "But Marin, it is nothing. The ground is thin. The well went dry years ago. The roof is gone. The wind up there will peel the skin right off your bones come winter." "I'll look at it," she said. Her decision was already made. She could feel it settling into her body, into her bones, the way a stone settles into a riverbed. Soil had taken everything from her. It had taken Dougal. It had taken their wheat, their home, their future. Maybe it was time to stop trusting the soil. Maybe it was time to build on rock. She thanked Jedediah. Her voice was steadier now, carrying a faint edge that might have been the first stirring of purpose she had felt in a year. He offered her the use of the wagon for another day and a feed of oats for Solomon. A quiet act of faith in a woman everyone else in this town was already preparing to forget. The land office was a small, square building next to the courthouse, its windows clouded with years of dust. Inside, a clerk sat behind a high counter, a man with a green visor pulled low over his forehead and ink stains on his fingers that looked permanent, as if the records he kept had slowly been absorbing him. He peered at her over his spectacles when she stated her purpose. "The Lockhart place?" A small, superior smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Ma'am, are you quite certain? There's a reason that property has sat unclaimed for 27 years. He climbed a short ladder and pulled a dusty ledger from a high shelf, blowing a cloud of neglect from its cover. The particles drifted in the slant of afternoon light like tiny ghosts. "Here we are. Lot 74, Silent Ridge. 16 acres, 1 stone structure, condition listed as derelict." He ran an ink-stained finger down the column. "Tax deed, $50. $50. Nearly everything she had left in the world. The sum total of a collapsed life. The ghost of 1,000 acres of Kansas wheat. A sturdy farmhouse, a husband, a future. All of it reduced to a thin stack of worn paper. She laid the money on the counter. The bills were soft and creased, handled so many times they felt like cloth. The clerk counted them slowly, his eyebrows rising slightly as if surprised they were real, as if he had expected her to come to her senses and pull them back. He filled out the deed with a scratching flourish. The pen was loud in the silent room, louder than it should have been, as if the document itself knew it was recording something significant. As he handed her the paper, he couldn't resist adding a footnote. Garrett Thornwall offered the county $10 for that lot last year. Said he wanted the stone for a boundary wall. You've paid 5 times what it's worth. He paused. If it's worth anything at all. Marin took the deed. The paper was cool against her fingers, heavier than a single sheet had any right to be. It felt less like a document and more like a wager, a bet placed against the world with everything she had left. She folded it carefully and slipped it inside her bodice, the paper resting against her skin like a second heartbeat. Then she turned and walked out without a word. Outside, the sun was low and bright, making her squint. The town seemed to hold its breath. News of her purchase was already moving down the street, traveling from mouth to mouth, faster than she could walk. The clerk had told someone that someone had told someone else. By the time she reached the boardwalk, the whole town knew. She was halfway back to the livery when the shadow fell over her. Garrett Thornwall sat astride a black stallion, the horse's coat gleaming like polished coal. The saddle was new leather, the kind that creaked with money. Thornwall himself was a big man, wide across the shoulders, his face permanently reddened by sun and whiskey and a lifetime of getting exactly what he wanted. He was 42 years old and looked like he owned the world. In Harrow Falls, he very nearly did. He looked down at her from the height of his horse. His gaze moved over her the way a man appraises livestock at auction. The worn dress, the dusty boots, the thin shoulders, the absence of a husband. "Hail," he said. Not her first name, not even her married name delivered with courtesy. Just the single syllable, dropped like something he was discarding. "I hear you bought the Lockhart rubble." Marin met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence seemed to unsettle him. He shifted in the saddle, the leather protesting. "I offered the county $10 for that plot," he said, louder now, projecting for the benefit of the men who had gathered outside the saloon to watch. "Just for the building stone. You paid 50. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a growl. "That tells me you've got more grief than sense. That ridge is useless. The water's gone. The soil is bare rock. You'll starve or freeze before spring." He waited for a response, a protest, an argument, tears, something he could push against, something that would confirm what he already believed about her, about all of them, anyone who didn't have what he had. He got nothing. Marin finished checking the knot on her wagon canvas and turned to Solomon, placing her hand on the mule's neck. The animal let out a slow breath through his nostrils. Forced patience made visible. Something shifted in Thornwall's face. The smugness cracked, and underneath it, just for a moment, she saw something that surprised her. It wasn't just contempt. It was anger, real anger. The kind that comes from not getting something you want. not the stone, not 16 acres of scrub and wind. Something else. He wanted that land. He wanted it badly. And the fact that a broke widow had bought it out from under him for $50 was eating at him in a way that had nothing to do with money. "When you're ready to admit your mistake," he said, yanking the reins, wheeling the stallion around, "I'll give you $5 for the deed, save you the walk back down." He kicked the horse into a trot, spraying dust that settled over Marin and the wagon like a fine, gritty insult. His laughter echoed off the false-fronted buildings as he rode away. She stood still, the dust in her hair, the laughter in her ears. Her hands were clenched at her sides, the nails cutting small crescents into her palms. It would have been easy to break, to feel what they wanted her to feel. The shame, the doubt, the crushing weight of a mistake. Instead, something shifted inside her. The frozen thing that had sealed itself shut the day Dougal died, cracked, just slightly, and what leaked through was not tears. It was anger, cold and clean and sharp as a blade drawn from ice water. They saw a broken woman. They saw a fool buying a ghost. Let them. She was turning to climb onto the wagon seat when a voice stopped her. Quiet and dry, like the sound of a page turning in an old book. The stone remembers what the soil forgets. Marin turned. An old woman sat on a bench in the narrow strip of shade beside the land office. She was wrapped in a dark blanket despite the warmth of the afternoon, her body small and still, as if she had been sitting there so long she had become part of the building itself. Her face was a map of deep lines, her skin dark and weathered, her eyes black and clear and sharp as obsidian. Nettie Crow. Marin recognized her the way you recognize a landmark. The old woman who lived alone in the foothills, native, rarely came to town. When she did, people stepped around her the way water moves around a rock in a stream, acknowledging her presence without quite engaging with it. "I'm sorry," Marin said, stepping closer. Nettie did not repeat herself. She never did. Instead, she gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the high northern ridge, where the chimney stack of the Lockhart ruin stood against the sky like a raised finger. "Some roots don't need water," she said. Her voice was like wind through dry grass. "They need stone, but stone only speaks to those who know how to be still." Then she looked away, her gaze fixing on something far beyond the dusty street, beyond the mountains, beyond anything Marin could see. The conversation was over. The audience had been granted and withdrawn in the space of 3 sentences. The words made no sense, and yet they settled into Marin's mind, not like a riddle, but like a seed dropped into a crack in rock. They didn't need to be understood yet. They just needed to be carried. She climbed onto the wagon.
She clucked to Solomon, and the old mule leaned into his harness with a groan that sounded almost human. The wagon creaked and began to roll, leaving the town and its scorn and its strange, cryptic prophecy behind. The road led up. The journey to Silent Ridge was a slow, grinding climb. The road, if you could call it that, was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the mountainside, half swallowed by sage and thistle. It left the fertile valley floor behind quickly, winding through sparse pine and juniper, the trees growing shorter and more twisted the higher they went, bent by years of wind into shapes that looked like frozen screams. The air thinned, the temperature dropped. The sounds of the town, already faint, disappeared entirely, replaced by three things: the creak of the wagon, the steady clop of Solomon's hooves, and the wind. The wind. It was a living thing up here, a constant pressing force that streamed through the pines with a sound like breathing. It tugged at the canvas cover of the wagon, whipped loose strands of hair across Marin's face, found every gap in her coat. Henderson at the Mercantile had been right about one thing. The wind never stopped. Solomon leaned into the incline, patient and methodical, his breath coming in steady white puffs. Marin felt a kinship with the animal so deep it was almost painful. Two tired creatures pulling a heavy load toward a destination neither of them could see clearly. The only difference was that Solomon didn't seem to mind. He just put one hoof in front of the other and kept going, as if the concept of giving up had never occurred to him. She envied that. She wanted to borrow it. By late afternoon, they reached the turnoff described on the deed. It was barely a path, more of a suggestion, overgrown with brush so thick Marin had to climb down twice to drag fallen branches out of the way. The wagon lurched and bucked over rocks and roots, and she held the reins so tight her knuckles went white, terrified that a wheel would shatter and strand them here in this nowhere place between the valley and the sky. The ridge was higher than she had expected, a spine of raw granite thrusting up from the mountainside like the backbone of some enormous buried animal. The sun was beginning to slip behind the western peaks, stretching the shadows into long, dark fingers that reached across the slope. The light went gold, then amber, then a deep bruised orange, and then, through a stand of gnarled, wind-stunted pines, she saw it. The ruin. It was less a cabin and more a memory of one. 4 low stone walls stood against the sky, but the roof was entirely gone. Its timbers had collapsed inward years ago, creating a tangled wreckage of splintered wood and debris that filled the interior like the rib cage of something dead. The chimney stack rose from one end, tall and solitary, a dark finger pointing at the heavens. There was no door, only a gaping hole. The windows were empty sockets. The 16 acres of land were not a field. They were a slope of rock and pale, thin soil choked with thorns and scrub, and the dry skeletons of plants
that had tried to grow here and failed. A single ancient oak tree stood near the ruin, its trunk thick and scarred, its branches twisted into tortured shapes by decades of wind. It looked less like a tree and more like a monument to endurance, something that had survived not because conditions were favorable, but because it simply refused to die. Jedediah had not exaggerated. Thornwall had not lied. It was nothing, worse than nothing. It was the physical manifestation of a mistake.
The wave of despair hit her so hard she actually staggered. It came up from somewhere deep, a cold black tide that swept away the anger and the determination and the fragile scaffolding of purpose she had been building all day, and left her standing in the fading light with nothing but the hollow certainty that she had just spent her last $50 on a grave. She brought Solomon to a halt. The mule lowered his head and stood motionless, his long ears drooping. Even he seemed to understand the scale of what they were looking at. Marin slid from the wagon seat, her legs stiff, her body sore from the climb. She walked toward the cabin slowly, her boots crunching on gravel and dead weeds. The air smelled like pine and cold stone and something else underneath, something old and mineral and faintly metallic, like the smell of a cave. She stopped at the threshold. The doorway gaped at her, dark and empty. Inside, the last of the daylight reached in at a low angle, illuminating a scene of absolute ruin. The floor was buried under rotted wood, fallen stone, and years of accumulated dirt. Weeds grew up through the cracks. The collapsed roof beams lay across each other like the bones of a great fallen animal. At the far end, the fireplace yawned open, a massive hearth of dark, soot-blackened granite choked with rubble. This wasn't a home waiting for repair. This was a place where something had ended. She leaned against the cold stone of the doorframe. The rough surface bit into her palm. The tears she had refused to shed in front of the town, in front of Thornwall, in front of Jedediah, in front of anyone, rose up now with a force that frightened her. They burned behind her eyes and tightened her throat and pressed against the inside of her chest like something trying to break free. She had come here looking for refuge, for a place so broken that nothing else could hurt her. Instead, she had found a mirror, a ruin reflecting a ruin. The land confirming what the world already believed, that she was finished. The sun dropped below the mountains. The sky went from orange to purple to the deep, bruised blue of a fresh wound. The wind picked up, moaning through the empty windows of the cabin, and the sound was so desolate, so perfectly aligned with the emptiness inside her, that it felt personal, as if the ridge itself were mourning. That night, she didn't try to go inside. She unhitched Solomon and gave him his small ration of oats. He ate with the slow, methodical patience of a creature who understood that survival was not dramatic. It was daily. She made her own cold camp in the lee of the wagon, wrapping herself in her bedroll, the wool scratchy against her skin. She lay on her back and looked up at the stars.
They were enormous up here, closer than she had ever seen them, blazing in a sky so black and deep, it looked like it went on forever. The wind moved over her in waves, cold and steady, carrying the scent of pine and stone. And then the tears came, not gently. They came the way a dam breaks, all at once, in a rush of grief so raw, it felt like being torn open. She cried for Dougal, for the wheat field she would never harvest, for the life she was supposed to have, for the woman she was supposed to be. She cried until her body ached and her throat was shredded, and the sounds coming out of her were not even human anymore. Just the raw noise of a heart being emptied. Solomon stood over her in the dark. She felt his warm breath on her face, his soft muzzle against her hair. He did not move away. He stood there, patient and solid, a living wall between her and the wind. And when the crying finally stopped, when she lay empty and hollowed out and strangely lighter, he let out a long, low breath through his nostrils. "We are still here." She slept fitfully, the wind her only companion, the stones of her new home whispering things she could not yet understand. She woke before dawn. The sky was a pale, bruised gray to the east, the stars fading like embers. Every muscle in her body ached. Her eyes were swollen and gritty from crying. The cold had crept into her joints during the night and settled there with a permanent feel. For a long moment, she considered Thornwall's offer. $5. She could pack up right now, lead Solomon back down the mountain, walk into town, and take his money. She could swallow her pride and beg for work. Washing clothes, sweeping floors. Whatever a woman with nothing could do in a town that had already decided she was nothing. The thought tasted like ash. She looked at the ruin. In the gray pre-dawn light, it was a dark, jagged silhouette against the sky, ugly and broken, and hers. Hers. A failure, yes, but her failure. Her pile of stones. Her 16 acres of wind and rock. To turn back now would be to prove every one of them right. Every whisper, every laugh, every pitying glance. It would confirm what Thornwall already believed, what the whole town believed, that she was exactly what she looked like. A broken woman with nowhere to go. She got up. Not with energy, not with hope, with something older and more stubborn than either. She got up because the alternative was to lie there, and lying there was a kind of dying, and she was not ready to die. Not yet. Not on this ridge, not where they could say they knew it would happen. She built a small fire, boiled water in a tin pot, made coffee, black and bitter and scalding hot. She ate a piece of dry bread, chewing slowly,
tasting nothing but making herself finish it, because her body was a tool, and tools needed fuel. Solomon watched her from the shade of the twisted oak, his dark eyes patient, his ears forward. After she ate, she walked to the cabin. In the clear, unforgiving light of morning, it looked even worse than it had at sunset. Every crack, every gap, every piece of rot was visible now, illuminated with a clarity that felt cruel. But today, she would not be defeated by the sight of it. Today, she would not feel. She would work.
She took the new axe head from the wagon and fitted it to a handle she had brought from the mercantile. She took the pry bar, the shovel, and a pair of heavy work gloves that were too big for her hands but would keep the splinters out. Her plan was simple because it had to be. Clear the debris, pull out the rotten timbers, haul away the fallen stone, get down to whatever was underneath. Start at the floor, start at the bottom, start at the place where everything had already fallen.
It was brutal labor. The collapsed roof beams were heavy and tangled together, wedged into the walls and into each other in a chaotic mess that seemed almost intentional, as if the ruin had been designed to resist being taken apart. She used the pry bar to lever them loose, the axe to chop through the pieces that wouldn't give. Splinters drove through her gloves and into her palms. Her shoulders burned, her back screamed, her hands blistered, the blisters broke, and the raw skin beneath them stung with every grip. She worked in silence. A grim, mechanical rhythm. Pry, chop, drag, pile. One beam at a time, one stone at a time. One piece of the dead past hauled out into the light and added to the growing mound outside. By midday, she had cleared a patch of floor near the doorway. Beneath the dirt and the rubble, she found it. Flagstone, rough cut and stained and cracked in places, but solid. Solid. The word moved through her like a current. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope, not yet, but the absence of despair, which was, for now, close enough. She kept going, deeper into the single large room. The world narrowed to the space within those 4 stone walls. There was nothing else. No town, no grief, no past. Just the next beam, the next stone, the next shovelful of dirt. The satisfying, emptying ache of muscles doing what they were made to do. As the afternoon wore on, she worked her way toward the great stone fireplace at the far wall. It was massive, a hearth of dark granite blackened by decades of soot, packed with rubble from the collapsed chimney. She began hauling out the larger stones, her arms trembling with the weight, and then used the shovel to dig into the smaller debris. The compacted ash and mortar and dirt that had filled the hearth like a sealed tomb. Her shovel struck something that was not loose rock. A dull, ringing clink. Metal on stone. She stopped, knelt down, began clearing the debris with her hands, the work gloves scraping against the packed ash. Buried at the very back of the hearth, pressed against the fire back as if someone had deliberately placed it there and then buried it, was a single smooth stone. It was unlike anything else in the fireplace. The granite of the hearth was rough and gray, local stone quarried from the ridge. This was different. Dark, almost black. But when she turned it in the fading light that angled through the empty window, veins of deep blue-green shimmered across its surface. The color of a peacock's feather. The color of deep water over a mineral bed. It was perfectly smooth, shaped like a large egg, and heavier than it should have been. Cool in her palm, even though it had been buried in ash. It didn't belong here. She stood up, wiping the soot from the stone with her glove. It was beautiful, strange and quiet and completely out of place. Why would it be here, tucked into the back of a fireplace in a collapsed cabin on a ridge no one cared about? A good luck charm, a keepsake, a decorative piece left behind by the mysterious Phineas Lockhart? She was about to add it to the rubble pile outside when she noticed something else. A piece of paper, folded tight and wedged into a crack in the fire back, exactly where the stone had been resting. The paper was yellowed and brittle, protected from the elements by the layers of ash that had sealed the hearth shut. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was small and precise, faded but legible in the last of the daylight. If you are reading this, then the cabin still stands, or at least its bones do. I have hidden the work of my life beneath the floor of this house. It is everything I came here to do and everything I was prevented from completing. Guard it well. There are those who wanted me dead for what I discovered, and they may want you dead too. Trust the stone. It remembers what the soil forgets. Phineas Lockhart, October 1862. Marin read the words twice, then a third time. The wind moaned through the cabin, fluttering the edges of the brittle paper. Solomon shifted in the doorway, his hooves scraping on the flagstone she had uncovered that morning. She looked around the ruined room with new eyes. The crumbling walls, the exposed floor, the massive fireplace with its hidden stone and its hidden letter. This place was not just a ruin, it was a vault. And the man who had built it had left a message for whoever came after. A warning and a promise, sealed in ash and stone. Waiting 27 years for someone desperate enough to dig this deep. There are those who wanted me dead for what I discovered. She thought of Thornwall, the anger on his face when she bought the land. Not the annoyance of a man who lost a minor deal. The fury of a man who lost something that mattered, something he couldn't afford to let someone else have. The light was almost gone. The sky through the empty windows was the color of a bruise. She folded the letter carefully and placed it with the deed against her skin. She slipped the blue-green stone into the pocket of her dress. It was heavy and cool against her leg. A secret weight. She didn't understand any of it. Not yet. But as she stood in the half-cleared cabin with the wind singing through the walls and the darkness coming on, the ruin no longer felt like a grave. It felt like something else. A question. And for the first time since Dougal died, Maren Hale wanted to know the answer. She looked at the inscription on the wall, the one Solomon had led her to that first morning. The letters carved into the stone by a steady hand 27 years ago.
The truth is in the stone, not in the soil. P.L. Tomorrow she would keep digging. Days became weeks. Weeks bled into a month. And Maren Hale's life found a rhythm that was older than language, older than thought. It was the rhythm of the body doing what the mind could not yet accept. Rise before dawn, build the fire, boil the water, eat the bread. Then walk to the cabin and begin again. The pile of rotten timbers outside grew taller with each passing day, a monument to labor and stubbornness. She cleared the entire cabin floor, working section by section, methodical as a surgeon, and what she found beneath the decades of debris surprised her. The flagstone foundation was not just intact, it was masterwork. The stones had been cut and fitted with a precision that spoke of patience and skill. Each piece seated against its neighbor so tightly that even after 27 years of neglect, the joints held. Whoever had laid this floor had not been building a temporary shelter. He had been building something meant to last, solid. She kept coming back to that word. It anchored her the way a keel anchors a ship. The floor was solid. Therefore, the walls could be repaired. Therefore, the roof could be rebuilt. Therefore, she could stay. Each conclusion resting on the one before it like stones in an arch. The logic of survival built one piece at a time. After the floor was clear, she started on the walls. She worked her way around the perimeter of the cabin, checking every stone with her hands, feeling for gaps, for looseness, for the places where wind and frost had worked their patient fingers into the mortar and pulled it apart. She mixed fresh mortar from clay and water, carrying it in buckets from a small trickling spring she had found a quarter-mile down the slope. The spring was barely more than a seep, a dark stain on a rock face, where water emerged from somewhere deep in the ridge and trickled down a groove worn smooth by years of flow. It wasn't much, but it was water, and on this ridge, water was everything. She filled the gaps in the walls one by one, pressing the wet mortar into the cracks with her bare hands when the trowel couldn't reach. The work was slow and tedious, the kind of labor that offered no visible progress for hours at a time. But she could feel the difference. Each sealed gap was one less place for the wind to enter.
Each repaired stone was one more piece of the wall holding firm. The cabin was tightening around her like a fist closing, and inside that fist, for the first time, she felt something close to safe. Her hands changed. The soft skin of a farmer's wife, already roughened by the Kansas years, became something else entirely. Calloused across the palms, cracked at the knuckles, the nails broken short and permanently edged with dirt. They were not beautiful hands. They were capable hands. Hands that knew the weight of stone and the texture of mortar and the exact angle needed to swing an axe so the blade bit true. She looked at them sometimes in the firelight, turning them over, studying them as if they belonged to someone else, someone stronger, someone she was becoming. The sun browned her skin. The constant labor stripped the softness from her frame and replaced it with lean, ropey muscle. She was not the woman who had arrived in the valley. That woman was gone, shed like a skin. What remained was harder, quieter, closer to the bone. She was becoming part of the ridge itself, as weathered and stubborn as the ancient twisted oak that stood beside the cabin. Solomon was her constant, her silent, patient shadow. The old mule would stand for hours in the shade of the oak, watching her work with his dark, liquid eyes, his ears occasionally flicking at a fly or turning toward a sound she couldn't hear. His calm was a thing she leaned on the way she leaned on the walls she was repairing. In the evenings, when she was too sore to move, she would sit beside him, her back against his warm flank, sharing a piece of apple, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing. He would let out a long, rumbling sigh, a sound so deep and contented that it seemed to come from the earth itself. And in that sound, she heard everything she needed. We are still here. We made it through another day. He was her only friend, the only living creature on this ridge who asked nothing of her and accepted her completely. Two solitary beings holding their ground against a world that had discarded them both. As she worked, she found more of the stones. They were not in the walls or the foundation. They were in the earth itself, scattered across the 16 acres like something sown. When she began the back-breaking task of clearing the land, pulling the thorny brush and dead scrub that choked every square foot of soil, her shovel would turn them up. Never on the surface, always buried a foot or two down, nestled in the thin, rocky ground like sleeping things waiting to be woken. Most were smaller than the first one she had found in the hearth, the size of a robin's egg, a walnut, a child's fist. But they all had the same strange density, the same cool weight that felt wrong for their size, as if they were made of something denser than ordinary rock. And they all had the same veins of deep blue-green running through the dark surface, shimmering when the light caught them, dull and almost invisible in shadow.
At first, she collected them out of simple curiosity. She piled them on the low section of wall she had finished rebuilding. A neat row of dark, gleaming eggs lined up along the stone. They were pretty, unusual, a small mystery in a place that offered little else. But as their numbers grew, her curiosity deepened into something more focused. There were too many of them, dozens, then scores, and they were not scattered randomly. They appeared in clusters, concentrated in certain patches of ground and absent from others, as if someone had placed them deliberately, not thrown, planted. Remembering Nettie Crow's words, Marin began to pay attention to what grew near the stones. The land looked barren on the surface, choked with thistle and sage, and the kind of tough, ugly scrub that thrives where nothing else can. But in the places where the blue-green stones were most dense, a different kind of plant was growing. A low, hardy herb with silvery green leaves and tiny flowers of a deep, vivid purple that seemed almost too rich for this austere landscape. It grew nowhere else on the ridge, only where the stones lay buried, as if the two were connected by some underground conversation she could not hear. She crushed a leaf between her fingers. The scent was immediate and startling, sharp and clean, like mint crossed with pine, but beneath it something else, something medicinal and ancient that she could not name. It cleared her sinuses and made her eyes water. It smelled like a remedy, like something a doctor would keep in a dark glass bottle on a high shelf. Some roots don't need water. They need stone.
The old woman's words circled back to her, less cryptic now, more like a map she was slowly learning to read. The stones and the herb were connected. The herb grew because the stones were there. And someone, long before Marin arrived, had put those stones in the ground on purpose.
One afternoon, while repairing a section of the flagstone floor near the hearth, her pry bar slipped between two stones and struck something underneath with a hollow metallic clang. The sound was so unexpected in the silence of the cabin that she flinched. She worked the bar back into the gap and levered up one of the heavy flagstones. It came loose with a grating groan, releasing the smell of damp, trapped earth. Soil that had not seen sunlight in decades. Beneath the stone was a shallow cavity carved into the bedrock, and nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly rotted into brown fragments, was a small tin box, rusted on the outside but intact. The kind of document box a careful man might use to protect important papers from fire or flood, or the slow, patient destruction of time. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it outside into the late afternoon light and sat on the wall she had rebuilt. The blue-green stones lined up beside her like an audience. Solomon, seeing the break in her routine, ambled over and nudged her shoulder with his soft nose, curious. The lid was rusted shut. She pried it open with the tip of her knife, the metal protesting with a screech that set her teeth on edge. Inside, preserved by the sealed environment, was a leather-bound journal, a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and several small paper packets, each one meticulously labeled in the same precise handwriting she recognized from the letter in the fireplace. She picked up the journal first. The leather was stiff and cracked, the pages brittle as dead leaves. On the first page, in ink that had faded from black to a dark sepia, was written, Phineas Lockhart, botanist, year of our Lord, 1855. Field notes, Silent Ridge, Montana Territory. Phineas Lockhart, the man her father had called a hermit, the man the town had called a lunatic, the man who had built this cabin and lived on this ridge and died alone while the world forgot him. He was not a hermit. He was not a lunatic. He was a scientist. Maren opened the journal and began to read. The wind died. The sun moved across the sky. Solomon stood beside her, patient as a stone. She did not notice any of it. She was gone, pulled backward through 27 years of silence into the mind of the man who had built this place. The journal was written in a clear, disciplined hand, the prose of a man trained to observe and record. Lockhart had come to this valley not for gold, not for timber, not for grazing land, but for its geology. He had been searching for a specific mineral composite he had first encountered in a paper published by a German mineralogist. He called it Petra Chirala, the blue stone. He believed it held properties that could fundamentally alter the way plants grew in poor soil. He had found it here, on this ridge, the blue-green stones. According to his notes, they were not simply pretty rocks. They were extraordinarily rich in copper, cobalt, manganese, and a dozen other trace minerals in a combination he had never encountered anywhere else. When buried in soil, they released these minerals slowly, over years, enriching the earth in ways that no surface fertilizer could replicate. They were not seeds. They were something better. They were the ground itself, improved from the inside out. Lockhart had not just built a cabin on this ridge. He had built a laboratory. The entire 16-acre plot was his experiment. He had buried hundreds of the blue-green stones at carefully calculated intervals, creating a grid of mineral enrichment across the barren slope. Then he had planted. The journal shifted from geology to botany, and Maren's hands began to shake. Lockhart had traveled the world before coming to Montana. The Andes, the Himalayas, the deserts of North Africa. He had collected seeds of rare, hardy, medicinal plants, species that thrived in the most hostile environments on Earth. Plants that could survive drought, frost, thin air, and poor soil. Plants that healed. His goal was to see if these resilient species could be cultivated here, in the unique mineral-rich soil of his stone garden, and used as a source of medicine for the remote communities of the American West. Communities that were too far from any city to have reliable access to a doctor or a pharmacy. Maren picked up one of the small paper packets. On it, in Lockhart's precise handwriting, was written, Rhodiola crenulata, Tibetan highlands, resilient to frost and drought. a powerful adaptogen for strength, endurance, and recovery from illness. Inside were tiny, dark seeds, dormant, waiting. Another packet, Salvia dorii, Great Basin, purple sage, brewed as a tea for fevers, lung ailments, and inflammation of the chest. The silvery leafed herb with the purple flower, the one growing all over her land, the one she had been stepping over for weeks, dismissing it as a weed. It was not a weed. It was a crop, a medicine. Phineas Lockhart had planted it here on purpose, and 27 years after his death, it was still growing, still thriving, still doing exactly what it had been designed to do, drawing minerals from the blue stones in the soil and converting them into healing. The last section of the journal was harder to read. The handwriting grew smaller, more cramped, as if the pages were running out, and there was still too much to say. Lockhart wrote of his funding, which came from a small university back east. For 3 years, they had supported his work with modest stipends and occasional shipments of supplies. Then, the letters had stopped. The money dried up. He wrote of hunger, of isolation, of the creeping despair that comes from doing important work that no one believes in. But the final pages were not about despair. They were about a different kind of fear. He wrote of a man, a wealthy rancher in the valley, who had initially offered to fund his research in exchange for a share of any commercial discovery. When Lockhart refused, the offers became threats. The man wanted the mineral rights to the ridge. He wanted the stones. He wanted to own whatever value this land might hold, and he was not accustomed to being told no. Lockhart did not name the man directly, but he described him in terms that left no doubt. The wealthiest landowner in the valley. A man who had inherited his fortune from his father and expanded it through intimidation and the systematic acquisition of every piece of property he could reach. A man who believed that what he wanted, he was entitled to take. Then Marin turned to the letters. They were from Lockhart's sister, a woman named Constance, living in Philadelphia. The early ones were warm, full of news and encouragement, asking about his work, sending small amounts of money when she could. The later ones were increasingly desperate, begging him to come home, warning him that the university had officially dismissed his research as eccentric nonsense, urging him to abandon the ridge before the winter killed him. The last letter in the stack had never been opened. It was addressed to Phineas Lockhart, Silent Ridge, Montana Territory, and across the front, in a postmaster's blunt hand, was stamped a single word: deceased. He had died up here, alone, his work unfinished, unrecognized, and buried under the same silence that buried everything on this ridge. But the journal's last page was missing, torn out. The ragged edge was still visible in the binding, a clean tear made by a deliberate hand. Someone had removed that page before Marin found the box. Someone who had been here before. someone who knew what the journal contained and wanted part of it erased. Maren looked up from the journal. The light had changed. The sun was low now, painting the ridge in shades of amber and shadow. She looked at the rocky slope with new eyes. The scattered patches of silver-leafed herbs, the dark gleam of blue-green stones on the wall beside her, the careful, deliberate layout of the land. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't a folly. It wasn't a dead man's grave.
It was a legacy. A garden of medicine planted in stone by a man who had given his life for it. And it had been waiting here, patient and silent, for 27 years, waiting for someone who would listen to the ground instead of the town. She looked at Solomon. The old mule looked back, his ears forward, his dark eyes steady. And for the first time since Dougal died, a smile touched her lips. Not a large smile, not a happy one, exactly, but real. The kind of smile that comes when you realize the story you are living is not the one you thought it was. She knew what she had to do.
The discovery changed the nature of the work. What had been a fight against the land became a partnership with it. Maren stopped clearing the scrub indiscriminately and began to work with intention. Following the faded maps and diagrams in Lockhart's journal, she built low stone terraces on the slope to prevent the thin soil from washing away in the rains, just as his notes described. She transplanted the wild purple sage into organized rows, giving each plant room to breathe and grow. She cleared the channel to the small spring and directed its meager flow toward the most promising beds. Her days were still punishing. The labor was no lighter than before, but the quality of it changed. There was a purpose now, a direction, and purpose made the same aching muscles feel different. She was not just surviving anymore. She was continuing something, finishing something. The ghost of Phineas Lockhart was a silent presence at her shoulder, his careful notes guiding her hands, his vision shaping her work. She felt an odd kinship with the dead man. He too had been alone. He too had been dismissed. He had come to this ridge with an idea that no one believed in and had given everything he had to prove it true. The world had let him die for it, and yet his work endured. The stones were still in the ground. The plants were still growing. The truth he had discovered was still here, written in the soil and the mineral veins and the stubborn, beautiful herbs that refused to die. If the world could forget a man like that, what else had it forgotten? What else was buried, waiting for hands willing to dig? Autumn arrived with a slow, cold hand, painting the valley below in shades of rust and gold. On the ridge, the change was harsher. The wind sharpened. The nights grew teeth. Frost appeared on the ground each morning, thin and glittering, and didn't melt until the sun was high. Maren could feel winter coming the way an animal feels it.
deep in the body, in the blood. It was close.
She worked with a new urgency. She had managed to repair a section of the roof over one corner of the cabin, using salvaged timbers braced with rope and covered with a canvas tarp weighted down with stones. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't permanent. But it was dry, and it kept the wind from cutting through her while she slept. She moved her bedroll and supplies into this small, sheltered corner, and for the first time since arriving on the ridge, she slept inside the cabin. Inside her cabin. The walls around her, the hearth at her feet, the dark sky visible through the gap where the rest of the roof should have been. She harvested the purple sage, cutting the stems carefully, drying the leaves in bundles hung from the repaired rafters. She collected seeds from the healthiest plants and stored them in Lockhart's original paper packets, adding her own notes in pencil beside his faded ink. She was preserving his work, carrying it forward, adding her own chapter to the story he had started. Then she went to the county records office. She told herself it was about the lawsuit she knew was coming. Thornwall had been too quiet since she bought the land, and quiet from a man like that was never a good sign. She needed to understand the legal history of the property, to make sure her deed was clean, to arm herself with paperwork against whatever he might try.
But the truth was simpler. She wanted to know what had happened to Phineas Lockhart. She wanted to know who had torn the last page from his journal. And she wanted to know why a man with Thornwall's resources would care so much about 16 acres of rock and wind.
The county clerk, a different man from the one who had sold her the deed, was bored and cooperative. He led her into the archive room, a dusty, windowless space stacked with ledgers and filing boxes that smelled of old paper and mouse droppings. She spent 2 full days in that room, reading by lamplight, tracing the history of Lot 74 back through decades of records. What she found made her blood run cold. In 1858, 3 years after Lockhart arrived on the ridge, a man named Cornelius Thornwall, Garrett's father, had filed a formal partnership claim on the property. The document stated that Cornelius had provided financial support for Lockhart's research in exchange for a 50% stake in any commercial discoveries. Lockhart had filed a counterclaim denying the partnership and accusing Cornelius of attempting to seize his work by fraud. The dispute had gone to the county judge. Cornelius had lost. The judge ruled that Lockhart was the sole owner of the property and its contents, and that Cornelius's claim had no legal basis.
But the records didn't stop there. In the months following the ruling, Cornelius Thornwall filed a series of tax liens against the property, claiming that Lockhart owed back taxes he had never been assessed. The liens were small, a few dollars each, but they accumulated. And when Lockhart died in the winter of 1862, there was no one to contest them. The property reverted to the county for unpaid taxes, and there it sat for 27 years. Unclaimed, unvisited, forgotten.
Except it wasn't forgotten, not by the Thornwalls. Because buried in the records, Marin found something else. A letter from Cornelius Thornwall to the county assessor, written in 1863, the year after Lockhart's death. In it, Cornelius requested that the property be held in tax default rather than sold at auction. His stated reason was that the land had no value and would find no buyer. His real reason, Marin now understood, was to keep it in limbo, to make sure no one else could buy it, to make sure whatever Lockhart had discovered stayed buried. Cornelius had died in 1871. His son Garrett had inherited everything, and Garrett had continued the same strategy, offering the county $10 for the property every few years, just enough to keep his name attached to it, just enough to make sure no one looked too closely. Until Marin walked in and paid $50. She sat in the archive room, the lamplight flickering, the old documents spread before her. She understood now. All of it. Thornwall's anger when she bought the land wasn't about stone for a boundary wall. It was about 27 years of careful, patient control, a family strategy spanning 2 generations, all of it undone by a broke widow who didn't know what she was buying.
They had wanted the land. They had wanted what was in it. And they had wanted, above all, for no one to find out what Cornelius had done to the man who discovered it.
The torn page from the journal. Cornelius must have gone up to the ridge after Lockhart died. He must have found the journal, read it, and torn out the page that implicated him. He didn't destroy the rest because he didn't think he needed to. The property would never be sold. The cabin would crumble. The journal would rot. The truth would disappear on its own. But the stones remembered. And the plants kept growing. And the truth, it turned out, was more patient than the lie.
2 weeks after her trip to the county archive, Garrett Thornwall made his move. A rider came up the ridge trail on a cold October morning, a young man in a clean coat carrying a leather satchel. He was polite, hat in hand, and he delivered a folded document to Marin with the careful formality of someone performing a legal act. It was a petition filed with the county court. Garrett Thornwall was challenging the validity of Marin's deed. The grounds were the old tax liens filed by his father, never formally resolved, now resurrected from the archive like bones dug up from a grave. The petition claimed that the property had never been legally released from tax default, and that Marin's purchase was therefore void. She had 60 days to respond. If she failed to appear, the court would rule in Thornwall's favor by default, and the property would be transferred to him for the cost of the outstanding liens. $12.40. Marin read the petition twice. She sat on the wall of the cabin, the blue-green stones at her feet, Solomon chewing his oats behind her, and she felt the cold, familiar weight of powerlessness settle over her. She had no money for a lawyer. She had no connections in this county. She was a widow from out of state with a $50 deed and a pile of rocks, and Garrett Thornwall had money, influence, and a legal claim that, on paper, looked legitimate. For a moment, the old despair rose up, the same black tide that had swallowed her on that first night. The voice that said, "Give up, walk away, take the $5 and disappear." She looked at her hands, the calluses, the cracked knuckles, the dirt under the broken nails. These were not the hands of a woman who walked away. These hands had cleared a cabin, rebuilt walls, moved stones, planted medicine. These hands had held a dying man and then picked up a shovel the next morning. She would fight, not with money, not with connections, with the one thing she had that Thornwall didn't, the truth. And she would find it herself. The sky changed on the 23rd day of October. The blue drained out of it like water from a cracked bowl, replaced by a strange, bruised yellow that made the landscape look sick. The wind, which had been blowing steadily for weeks, died. The sudden stillness was worse than the noise. It was the silence of something holding its breath.
Solomon knew before she did. He paced the cabin floor, his hooves clicking on the flagstone, his ears flat against his head, his nostrils flaring. He sniffed the air with short, sharp breaths and let out a low sound she had never heard from him before. Not a bray. A warning. Maren had seen a sky like this once, in Kansas, the year before Dougal died. It meant a blizzard, a bad one. And it was coming early, weeks before it should. She moved fast. She brought Solomon fully inside the cabin, into the main room where the roof was still open to the sky. She banked the fire in the hearth high and hot. She stacked every piece of firewood she had inside the door. She secured the canvas tarp over her supplies and tied it down with rope, her fingers numb and clumsy with the sudden cold. The snow began just after dusk. It did not begin gently. There was no gradual shift, no soft first flakes drifting down like feathers. One moment, the air was still. The next, a horizontal wall of white slammed into the ridge with a force that staggered her. The wind returned from nowhere, shrieking around the stone walls with a sound like tearing metal, driving the snow so hard it stung the skin like thrown sand. Inside the cabin, Maren huddled by the fire, wrapped in every piece of cloth she owned. Solomon stood in the far corner, his head low, his body trembling. The storm was a physical assault, a living thing that hated the cabin and everything inside it and was trying, with patient, howling fury, to tear it all apart. Sometime deep in the second hour of the storm, over the roar of the wind, she heard something that made her blood freeze. A voice, human, faint and ragged, swallowed almost instantly by the storm, but unmistakable. Someone was out there. She grabbed her lantern and fought her way to the doorway. The wind nearly tore the door from her grip. Through the blinding curtain of snow, she saw nothing. Then another cry, weaker, coming from below, from the trail. She did not think. She did not weigh the risks. She pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a rope around her waist, tied the other end to a support beam inside the cabin, and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit her like a fist to the chest. It stole her breath and froze the moisture in her nostrils. The wind tore at her coat and drove snow into her eyes. She could see perhaps 3 feet in any direction. The world was gone, replaced by a howling white void. She followed the rope. She followed the sound. Step by step, leaning into the wind, her boots sinking into snow that was already a foot deep and rising. The rope paid out behind her, her lifeline, the only thread connecting her to warmth and shelter and survival. She found them 100 yards down the slope. A man, a woman, and 2 small children, huddled against the side of a wagon whose front wheel had shattered in a rut. They were dressed for autumn travel, not for a blizzard. Their coats were thin. Their faces were the color of ash. The man was trying to shield his family with his own body, but he was fading, his movements slow and dreamlike, the first signs of the cold shutting him down.
"Help!" he said. The word was barely a whisper, torn away by the wind before it reached her.
"I have shelter!" Marin shouted over the storm. "Come with me! Now!" Getting them to their feet was a battle. The woman Ruth could barely stand. She was coughing, a deep, wet, rattling sound that came from somewhere in the bottom of her lungs. The kind of cough Marin had heard before. In Kansas, in the houses where the fever went. The younger child, a girl of maybe 3, was frighteningly still in her father's arms, her lips blue, her eyes closed. They followed the rope. 5 people in a chain, leaning on each other, fighting for every step. Marin led, pulling the rope hand over hand. The wind screaming in her ears, the snow blinding her. Twice she lost her footing and went down, and twice she hauled herself up because the rope was still there and the cabin was at the other end, and she was not going to let these people die on her ridge.
They reached the cabin. Getting through the door was a final, desperate struggle against the wind. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a shock, a physical wave that hit their frozen bodies and made them cry out. They collapsed on the flagstone floor, shivering so hard it looked like convulsions. Marin moved. She stripped the wet coats from the children and wrapped them in her blankets. She stoked the fire until it roared. She heated water. She chafed the little girl's hands between her own until the blue faded from her lips, and she began to whimper. The most beautiful sound Marin had ever heard, because it meant alive. The man's name was Ephraim Pierce. His wife was Ruth. They had been traveling from the north, heading toward a settlement in the valley when the storm caught them on the ridge road. He was a carpenter, broad-shouldered and quiet, with the thick hands of a man who made his living with tools. He watched Marin with eyes full of a gratitude so vast it had no words. But Ruth was not recovering. The coughing grew worse as the night went on, deep and constant, each spasm racking her thin frame. Her breathing became shallow, a high whistling sound that Marin could hear from across the room. When Marin placed her hand on Ruth's forehead, the heat was shocking. The fever was climbing fast. Pneumonia, The word formed in Marin's mind with a terrible clarity. She had seen it take people in Kansas, strong people, people with access to doctors and medicine and warm, dry beds. Ruth had none of those things. The nearest doctor was in Harrow Falls, a full day's ride in good weather. In this storm, he might as well be on the other side of the moon. Marin felt the panic rising. She could build a wall. She could clear a floor. She could haul stone and chop wood and survive alone on a ridge for weeks. But she could not cure pneumonia with willpower. She was not a doctor. She had nothing. Then her eyes fell on the tin box. Lockhart's journal sitting on the shelf she had built beside the hearth, and beside it the bundles of dried herbs she had harvested, the purple sage, Salvia dorii, brewed as a tea for fevers, lung ailments, and inflammation of the chest. She had never used it. She had never tested it. She had no idea if it would work or if it would make things worse. She was a woman with a dead man's notebook and a handful of dried leaves, and a stranger's wife was dying in her cabin. She made the tea. She crushed the dried sage leaves in her hands, the sharp, clean scent filling the small room, cutting through the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. She steeped them in boiling water for the count that Lockhart's notes prescribed. The liquid turned a deep, murky green. She knelt beside Ruth and lifted her head, holding the warm cup to her cracked lips. "Drink this," she said. Her voice was steady, steadier than she felt. "It will help you breathe." Ruth drank. She coughed. She drank again. Ephraim watched with eyes that held nothing but naked, desperate hope. The blizzard raged for 2 days and 2 nights. Inside the small fire-lit corner of the cabin, Marin brewed the sage tea every few hours. The sharp medicinal steam, a constant presence in the air. She shared her food. Bean stew cooked in a single pot over the fire. Flatbread baked on a hot stone. It wasn't enough for 5 people, but it was something. And something was the difference between living and dying. She watched Ruth the way a farmer watches the sky, looking for signs, looking for change. The first night was the worst. The fever climbed so high that Ruth's skin was dry to the touch, and her breathing became a sound that filled the cabin, a thin, desperate whistle that made Marin's chest ache with sympathetic fear. She brewed the tea stronger. She soaked cloths in cool water and placed them on Ruth's forehead. She talked to her a low, steady stream of words that didn't matter. Words meant only to say, "You are not alone. You are not alone." Sometime in the second night, the fever broke. It didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic moment, no gasp, no sudden clarity in Ruth's eyes. Marin simply noticed during one of her hourly checks that Ruth's forehead was cooler, that the rattling in her chest had eased, that her breathing had deepened from a whistle to something slower, something that sounded less like a struggle and more like rest.
She sat back on her heels and closed her eyes. The relief was so immense it felt like grief in reverse, the same overwhelming flood, but warm instead of cold. She pressed her hand against her mouth and breathed through her fingers, and did not let herself cry because there were still people depending on her. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, the world was transformed. The sun came through the gap in the roof and fell on a landscape of pure, blinding white. The ridge, the valley, the mountains. Everything was buried under a deep blanket of snow that sparkled in the light like a field of crushed diamonds. It was silent, absolutely silent. The wind had stopped. The storm had said everything it had to say.
Ephraim stood in the doorway, his children clinging to his legs, and looked out at the white world. Then he turned to Maren. "We owe you our lives," he said. His voice was thick. His eyes were wet. He was a man who had spent 2 days watching his wife die and then not die, and the weight of that was still on him, pressing down, making everything he said sound like it came from a great depth.
Oliver, I don't know how we're going to ever repay that.
There's nothing to repay, Maren said. She was standing by the fire, Solomon behind her, the mule's warm breath on her neck. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had not slept in 3 days. She also looked like a woman who had found something in those 3 days that all the months of solitary labor on the ridge had not given her. She had saved someone with her hands, with Lockhart's medicine, with the knowledge hidden in the ground of a forgotten ruin. The purple sage had worked. Not perfectly, not miraculously, not in a way that any doctor would call scientific, but the fever had broken. Ruth was breathing. The children were alive. The stones had spoken, and she had listened. It took 2 more days for the snow to melt enough for safe travel. Ephraim Pierce spent that time doing what a carpenter does when he owes a debt that words cannot carry. He worked. He braced the weakest section of the roof with timbers salvaged from the Pierce wagon, which was beyond repair. He reinforced the doorframe. He built a simple shelf beside the hearth, sturdy and square. The joints fitted so tightly they needed no nails. He did these things in silence, his broad hands moving with the practiced certainty of a man who understood that gratitude, real gratitude, is not spoken. It is built. Ruth grew stronger by the hour. The color returned to her face in stages like dawn coming over the ridge. First, the gray faded from her lips. Then a faint warmth crept into her cheeks. Then her eyes cleared, losing the glassy, faraway look of fever and filling with something sharp and present. On the second morning, she stood on her own, swaying slightly, one hand on the wall, and walked to the doorway to look at the snow-covered ridge.
She turned to Marin. Her eyes were full.
"That tea," she said, her hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she could still feel the medicine working inside her. "I was drowning. I could feel the water in my lungs, and I couldn't get above it. And then I drank that tea, and it was like someone opened a window." "What was it?" "An old remedy," Marin said, glancing at the journal on its new shelf. "From the mountain." When the Pierce family finally made their way down the trail toward Harrow Falls, Marin stood at the edge of the ridge and watched them go. The two children rode on Ephraim's back, and Ruth walked beside him, one hand on his arm, moving slowly but moving. At the bend in the trail, just before the pines swallowed them, Ephraim stopped and turned. He raised one hand, not a wave, a salute, the gesture of a man acknowledging something larger than a favor. Marin raised her hand in return. Then they were gone, and the ridge was silent again.
Solomon stood beside her, his breath clouding in the cold air. She placed her hand on his neck and stood there for a long time listening to nothing. The story the Pierce family told in Harrow Falls traveled faster than a fire through dry brush.
They told it at the boarding house where they took a room. They told it at the mercantile where Ephraim bought supplies to replace what the storm had taken. They told it at the saloon where men gathered in the evenings to drink and talk and measure the world against their own experience. They told it to anyone who would listen, and in a town the size of Harrow Falls, that was everyone. They spoke of a blizzard that should have killed them, a broken wagon on a mountain road in the dark, the cold closing in, shutting down their bodies inch by inch. And then a light, a woman's voice, a rope in the howling white void, leading them to shelter. They spoke of the stone cabin on the ridge, warm and dry, the fire in the great hearth, throwing shadows on the walls. They spoke of the tea, the strange, sharp-smelling brew that had pulled Ruth back from the edge of something final. The townspeople listened in silence. The men outside the saloon, the same men who had laughed at Marin's purchase, set down their glasses and said nothing. The women in the mercantile, who had whispered about the poor Vance girl coming home with nothing, found that the whispers had dried up in their mouths. Henderson, the store owner, who had told her the wind never stopped, stood behind his counter and felt something uncomfortable shifting in his chest. Something that might have been shame. The laughter died. The pity curdled into something more complicated. They had written her off, every single one of them. And while they were busy writing her off, she had rebuilt a ruin with her bare hands and then used it to save a family from the worst storm in a decade. A week after the Pierce family arrived in town, a rider made his way up the winding trail to Silent Ridge. The horse was a good one, a sturdy bay mare built for mountain roads, and the man on its back sat with the straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. He was in his late 50s, lean and weathered, with sharp gray eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a black leather bag strapped behind his saddle. Dr. Leland Hargrove was the only physician within 50 miles of Harrow Falls. He had practiced medicine in the valley for 23 years, and in that time he had developed a reputation for two things: competence and honesty. He did not sugarcoat diagnoses, he did not promise miracles, and he did not make house calls to the top of a wind-blasted ridge unless he had a very good reason. He found Marin on her hands and knees in the terraced beds, clearing the last of the storm damage. Her fingers red with cold, her hair tied back with a strip of leather. She looked up at him with the wary expression of a woman who had learned to expect nothing good from visitors. "Miss Hale," he said, dismounting. He removed his hat. "I heard a remarkable story in town about the Pierce family, about what happened during the storm." Marin stood. She wiped her hands on her apron and waited. "They said you treated Mrs. Pierce's pneumonia with an herb," he continued, his eyes holding the careful, neutral curiosity of a man trained to withhold judgment until the evidence was in. "An herb you grew here on this ridge. May I ask what it was?" She could have told him. She could have described the sage, explained Lockhart's notes, handed him a bundle of dried leaves, and sent him on his way. But something made her pause. Some instinct born from months of solitude and self-reliance told her that this moment mattered, that showing was more powerful than telling, that a man like Hargrove needed to see the whole picture, not just a single brushstroke. "Come inside," she said. She showed him everything, the cabin rebuilt stone by stone, the flagstone floor she had uncovered, the great hearth where she had found the first blue-green stone, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, filling the air with their sharp, clean scent, the organized seed packets, Lockhart's originals beside her own additions, labeled in two different hands, separated by nearly 3 decades. And then she showed him the journal. She placed it on the table Ephraim had built, opened it to the first page, and stepped back. She did not narrate. She did not explain. She let Phineas Lockhart speak for himself. Dr. Hargrove sat at that rough table for over 2 hours. He turned the brittle pages with hands that grew steadily more reverent as he read. He studied the botanical sketches, the mineral analyses, the planting diagrams. He examined the blue-green stones Marin had collected, holding them up to the light from the window, turning them slowly, watching the veins shimmer. He crushed a leaf of the purple sage between his fingers and inhaled deeply, his eyes closing, his brow furrowing in concentration. When he finally looked up, the careful neutrality was gone from his face. In its place was something Marin had not expected. It was awe. Not the cheap, theatrical kind, the quiet kind, the kind that comes when a person who has spent decades mastering a discipline encounters something that expands the boundaries of everything they thought they knew. "Phineas Lockhart," he said almost to himself. "I read his early papers when I was a young man in medical school. A professor mentioned him once, dismissed him as a crank. a man chasing impossible connections between geology and botany. He shook his head slowly. He wasn't a crank. He was right about all of it. He looked around the cabin at the neatly stored herbs, the careful terraces visible through the window, the blue-green stones edging the garden beds. Then he looked at Marin. "And you, Miss Hale?" He said, his voice quiet, and waited with a respect that had nothing performative about it. "You brought it all back to life."
He confirmed everything she had come to believe and things she had not dared to hope. The purple sage was a known but exceedingly rare anti-inflammatory documented in scattered medical literature, but never successfully cultivated. The rhodiola was a legendary adaptogen used in Tibetan medicine for centuries, prized for its ability to restore strength and endurance. The other plants described in Lockhart's journal species Marin had not yet identified growing on her land were a pharmacopoeia, a living medicine cabinet perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of the Mountain West, growing in soil that shouldn't have been able to support a weed. Before he left, Dr. Hargrove did something that changed the trajectory of Marin's fight. He sat at Ephraim's table and wrote a formal report. 3 pages in the precise clinical language of a physician documenting the medicinal properties of the herbs he had examined, the botanical significance of Lockhart's work, and the therapeutic results Marin had achieved in treating Ruth Pierce's pneumonia. He signed it, dated it, and placed it in Marin's hands. "For the court," he said. "I understand Thornwall has filed a challenge. This report establishes that the property has significant scientific and medical value, which may be relevant to the judge's consideration." He paused. "It also establishes that you, Miss Hale, are the person who recognized that value and put it to use. That matters." He mounted his horse, settled his hat, and looked down at her. "I'll be back," he said, "with a proper list of what I need. There are people in this valley and the next who are suffering from ailments that your garden can help, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Marin said. He nodded once. Then he rode down the trail, and Marin stood holding 3 pages of paper that felt in their own way as heavy as the deed she carried against her skin. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Marin's time on the ridge, and not because of the weather or the labor. They were hard because Garrett Thornwall was no longer content to fight her in a courtroom. It started small. She came out one morning to find a section of her terraced wall knocked over the stones scattered down the slope. The sage plants she had carefully transplanted crushed beneath them. It could have been an animal, a deer, a bear stumbling through in the dark. But the damage was too precise, too targeted. The wall had been pushed at its weakest point, the exact spot where the mortar was newest and hadn't fully cured. Someone who knew stone would know where to push. She rebuilt it. It took her 2 days. She said nothing about it to anyone. A week later, the spring went bad. She walked down the slope with her water buckets to find the seep fouled the clear water, replaced by a murky chemical-smelling trickle that made Solomon snort and back away. Something had been dumped into the source above the seep, something deliberate. She spent a full day clearing the contamination, digging out the fouled soil, rerouting the channel. She carried water from a secondary source half a mile further down the ridge,
making 4 trips with full buckets, her shoulders screaming while the garden beds dried and the frost crept closer. She rebuilt the channel. She purified the spring. She said nothing. The third attack was the boldest. She returned from a trip to the county archive to find boot prints in the soft earth near the cabin. Large boots. A man's stride. The prints led to the cabin door, which she had secured with a heavy wooden bar Ephraim had fashioned. The bar was splintered, but had held. Whoever had tried to force the door had failed, but they had left a message. Carved into the wood of the door itself in rough, angry letters. Leave.
She ran her fingers over the letters. The wood was freshly cut, the shavings still on the ground. She looked at the word for a long time. Then she went inside, got Lockhart's journal, and made sure it was safe. She checked the seed packets. She checked the dried herbs. Everything was intact.
She did not leave.
She did not report the break-in to the sheriff, who was a man known to fold his cards whenever Thornwall sat down at the table. Instead, she did something that required more courage than any of it. She kept working. She tended the garden. She dried the herbs. She prepared for winter, and she prepared for court.
The court date was set for the second week of November. Marin spent every evening by the fire reading and rereading the documents she had gathered. The county records showing Cornelius Thornwall's fraudulent tax liens, Dr. Hargrove's medical report, Lockhart's journal with its torn last page and its damning references to a wealthy valley rancher who had tried to seize his work. And she had one more piece of evidence. A gift from Jedediah Dunn. The old man had ridden up to the ridge on a cold afternoon 2 weeks before the court date, his horse picking its way carefully through the early snow. He looked older than she remembered, thinner. The years were heavy on him, and the ride up the mountain had cost him more than he would admit. He sat by her fire, warming his hands, Solomon watching him from the corner, with the calm appraisal of an animal who has learned to judge character. "Found something," Jedediah said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and fragile. "My father kept everything. Letters, receipts, notes. After he died, I boxed it all up and stuck it in the back of the livery. Never had reason to look through it." He unfolded the paper carefully and handed it to Marin. Until now. It was a letter, written in Phineas Lockhart's hand, addressed to Jedediah's father, dated October 1862. The same month as the letter Marin had found in the fireplace. In it, Lockhart wrote with a clarity born of desperation. He described his work. He described the blue stones and the medicinal garden. And then he described what Cornelius Thornwall had done, the fraudulent partnership claim, the manufactured tax liens, the threats, and something more, something that made Marin's hands go cold around the edges of the paper. Lockhart wrote that Cornelius had visited the ridge in September of that year, that they had argued, that Cornelius had told him in plain words that if Lockhart did not sign over the property and all rights to his discoveries, he would make sure Lockhart never left the ridge alive. Lockhart had refused. And in the letter, he asked Jedediah's father to hold this account as a record in case something happened to him.
Something had happened to him. 2 months after writing this letter, Phineas Lockhart was dead. Marin looked up from the letter. Jedediah was watching her with eyes that held a sorrow older than the paper in her hands. "My father never did anything with it," he said quietly. "Cornelius Thornwall was the most powerful man in the valley. My father had a family. He was afraid." He paused. "I've been afraid too, my whole life. Afraid of the Thornwall name. Afraid of what it cost to stand up to money." He looked at the fire, his weathered face lit by the flickering light, and then back at Marin.
I'm too old to be afraid anymore.
The county courthouse in Harrow Falls was a plain square building of local stone 2 stories high, with a flag hanging limp in the cold November air. It was not a grand hall of justice. It was a room where men settled disputes over cattle and fences and water rights, and the judge who presided, a man named Whitfield, was a practical, no-nonsense rancher himself, who had been elected to the bench because he was the only man in the county everyone trusted to be fair.
The courtroom was full. Word had spread. The whole valley had come to see what would happen when the richest man in Harrow Falls tried to take the land from the woman who had saved the Pierce family in a blizzard. Farmers, shopkeepers, wives, children. They lined the wooden benches and stood along the walls, their breath clouding in the unheated room. Garrett Thornwall sat at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer from Helena, a man named Prescott, in a tailored suit, who looked at the rough courtroom and its rough occupants with barely concealed disdain. Thornwall himself was dressed in his best, his boots polished, his jaw set, with the rigid confidence of a man who had never lost anything he fought for. Marin sat alone at the defendant's table. She wore her cleanest dress, which was also her only dress that didn't have mortar stains on the sleeves. Her hair was tied back. Her hands, calloused and scarred, rested flat on the table in front of her. She had no lawyer. She had a stack of documents, Lockhart's journal, and a blue-green stone in her pocket. Judge Whitfield called the proceedings to order. Prescott, the Helena lawyer, rose and presented Thornwall's case with the smooth, practiced delivery of a man who billed by the hour. The tax liens were real, he argued. They had never been formally discharged. The property had never been legally released from default. Therefore, the sale to Miss Hale was invalid, and the property should rightfully revert to the Thornwall estate, which had maintained a standing offer on the lot for nearly 3 decades.
It was clean. It was logical. It sounded right. And watching the faces in the courtroom, Marin could see that some of them believed it. Then it was her turn. She stood. She did not clear her throat. She did not apologize for not being a lawyer. She did not perform. She simply began in the same clear, steady voice she used when she was alone on the ridge, talking to Solomon, talking to the stones, talking to the ghost of a dead botanist whose work she had spent the last 3 months learning to understand. She started with the deed. She laid it on the judge's bench, the paper worn soft from being carried against her skin. She explained that she had purchased the property in good faith from the county itself, through the same land office that had held it for 27 years. The county had accepted her money. The county had issued the deed. If the tax liens made the sale invalid, then the county, not Marin Hale, was the party at fault. Then she laid out the county records, the filings she had found in the archive, the original tax liens filed by Cornelius Thornwall in 1860 and 1861, and beside them the original court ruling from 1858, in which a county judge had already determined that Cornelius Thornwall had no legal claim to the property or its contents. These liens, Marin said, holding up the documents, were filed by a man who had already been told by this court that he had no right to the property. They were not legitimate tax assessments. They were a tool of harassment designed to prevent anyone else from purchasing the land after Mr. Lockhart's death. She placed Dr. Hargrove's report on the bench. She explained in simple factual terms what Phineas Lockhart had built on Silent Ridge. A garden of rare medicinal herbs cultivated in mineral-enriched soil, capable of treating illnesses that the people of this valley had no other remedy for. She described the treatment of Ruth Pierce's pneumonia. She noted that Dr. Hargrove, a licensed physician of 23 years standing, had examined the herbs and confirmed their medical value. Then she placed Jedediah Dunn's letter on the bench. The old man was sitting in the front row of the gallery, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on Marin. She read the letter aloud. Lockhart's words, written in October of 1862, describing Cornelius Thornwall's threats. The demand to sign over the property. The warning that Lockhart would never leave the ridge alive if he refused. 2 months after writing this letter, Marin said Phineas Lockhart was found dead in his cabin. The cause of death was listed as exposure. No investigation was conducted. The courtroom was silent. The silence had a weight to it, a physical density that pressed against the walls and the windows and the people sitting on the hard wooden benches. Thornwall's face had gone the color of old brick. Prescott, the Helena lawyer, was scribbling furiously on a pad of paper, but his pen had stopped making letters. He was just pressing the nib into the paper, leaving marks that meant nothing. Judge Whitfield looked at the document spread before him. He looked at Thornwall. He looked at Marin. He took a long time. The tax liens filed by Cornelius Thornwall, he said, his voice flat and measured, were filed subsequent to a court ruling that denied his claim to the property. They are therefore irregular and cannot serve as the basis for a challenge to a subsequent sale. He paused. The deed held by Miss Hale is valid. The petition is denied. A murmur moved through the courtroom like a wave. Thornwall's face went from red to white. He half rose from his chair. That land belongs to my family, he said. His voice was loud, strained, cracking at the edges. My father knew what was up there. He had a right to it. He had a claim. Marin had been about to sit down. She stopped. She turned to face him, and then she did the thing she had been waiting to do since the night she found the first blue-green stone in the hearth of a ruined cabin. She reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the stone, the large one, the first one, the one shaped like an egg, dark and heavy, its blue-green veins catching the light from the courtroom windows. Your father knew what was up there, she repeated, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. You're right. He did. She held up the stone. Then with her other hand, she twisted it. The stone was not solid. It was hollow. Lockhart had hollowed it out, carved a cavity inside the densest, heaviest stone in his collection, the one any thief would dismiss as just another rock. The two halves separated with a faint grinding sound. Inside was a folded piece of paper, small, brittle, the same paper as the journal, the same ink, the same precise handwriting. This is the last page of Phineas Lockhart's journal, Marin said. The page that was torn out. Lockhart knew someone would come for his notes. He knew someone would try to destroy the evidence. So he made a copy of the most important page and hid it in the one place no one would think to look, inside a stone. She unfolded the page and read it aloud. Her voice was steady. Her hands did not shake. Lockhart had written his final entry on the day he knew he was going to die. The date was December 14th, 1862. He wrote that Cornelius Thornwall had come to the ridge 2 days earlier with 2 hired men. They had argued. Lockhart had refused again to sign over his work. And when he refused, Cornelius had done something that Lockhart had feared, but had not truly believed a man was capable of. They had nailed the cabin door shut from the outside. They had blocked the windows with stones, and they had left in December. On a ridge where the temperature dropped below 0 and the wind blew without mercy, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Cornelius Thornwall had not merely stolen a dead man's work. He had made the dead man dead. He had sealed Phineas Lockhart inside his own cabin, like a man bricking up a tomb, and walked away, and the cold had done the rest. Marin finished reading. She looked at Garrett Thornwall. His face was the face of a man watching a building collapse floor by floor. Each revelation another support beam giving way. He didn't speak. He couldn't speak. The room was so quiet she could hear the flag outside stirring in the cold wind. She folded the page and placed it on the judge's bench beside the other documents. Then she sat down. Judge Whitfield stared at the page for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not the measured procedural tone of a man reading a ruling. The heavy, careful voice of a man who understood that what had just happened in his courtroom would be remembered in this valley for a very long time.
This court has ruled on the property matter, he said. The deed stands. As for the other matters raised by this testimony, they are beyond the scope of today's proceedings. But they are noted, and they will not be forgotten. He looked directly at Thornwall. The look said everything his words did not. Garrett Thornwall stood. The Helena lawyer was already packing his bag, his face carefully blank, a man distancing himself from a client who had become a liability. Thornwall looked around the courtroom at the faces of his neighbors, the people he had bullied and bought and controlled for 20 years. And what he saw, there was something he had never seen before. Not fear, not deference, something worse. They knew, all of them. They knew what his father had done. And they knew that he had known and had tried to finish the job by taking the land from the woman who had uncovered the truth. He walked out of the courthouse without a word. His boots echoed on the wooden floor loud in the silence, and then the door closed behind him, and he was gone. He would never speak of Silent Ridge again. He would never ride up that trail. He would never look at the chimney stack on the high ridge without feeling the weight of a dead man's journal pressing down on the name he had inherited. The courtroom emptied slowly. People filed out in small groups, talking in low voices, the story already being shaped and reshaped as it passed from mouth to mouth. By nightfall, everyone in the valley would know. By spring, they would know 3 valleys over. The story of the widow who bought a ruin and found a dead man's garden and stood up alone in a courtroom and broke the most powerful man in the county with a hollow stone and a piece of paper. Marin was the last to leave. She gathered her documents, placed the journal carefully in her bag, and slipped the hollow stone back into her pocket. It was lighter now, empty of its secret, but she kept it anyway. It had been the first beautiful thing she found in a place of decay. It would stay with her. Outside, the November sun was thin and cold and clear. Jedediah Dunn was waiting by the courthouse steps, his horse's reins in one hand. He looked at her with eyes that held a complicated mixture of pride and relief, and the residual guilt of a man who had waited too long to do the right thing, but had done it in the end. "Your father would have been proud," he said. Marin nodded. She could not speak. The knot was back in her throat, the old familiar tightness, but it was different now. Not grief, not anger, something warmer, something that didn't have a name yet. She rode back up the ridge with Solomon. The mule took the trail slowly, as he always did, placing each hoof with the deliberate patience of a creature who understood that getting there was more important than getting there fast. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber and the deep, endless blue of a Montana winter. Spring came slowly to Silent Ridge. It came not as a sudden eruption of green, but as a gradual, patient thaw, the snow retreating inch by inch, revealing the dark earth beneath the stone terraces, the dormant beds where seeds waited in mineral-rich soil for the signal to begin. And when it came, the ridge came alive. The purple sage was first pushing up through the thin crust of frost with a determination that seemed almost personal. Silvery green leaves unfurling in neat rows along the terraces, followed by the tiny purple flowers that opened to the sun like eyes waking from a long sleep. Then the rhodiola sending up thick, succulent shoots from the rocky soil, tough and resilient, thriving in conditions that would kill any ordinary plant. Then the others, dozens of species whose names Marin now knew by heart, each one emerging from the ground in its own time. Each one a living testament to the work of a man who had died believing his garden would die with him. The air thickened with the scent of herbs, mint and pine and sage, and 100 subtler notes, medicinal and green and alive, carried by the wind that never stopped blowing, but now seemed less like an enemy and more like a partner, spreading the fragrance down the slope and into the valley below. Dr. Hargrove became a regular visitor. He came every 2 weeks riding up the trail with his black bag and a list of needs and riding back down with carefully measured bundles of herbs. Sage for the Cooper woman's chronic cough. Rhodiola for old Emmett West, who was fading from a weariness that no amount of rest could cure. Poultices and tinctures and dried leaf preparations, each one formulated from Lockhart's notes, each one delivered to patients who had been suffering without remedy in a valley too remote for regular medical supply. The path to the cabin, once overgrown and forgotten, became a well-worn trail. People came, not just for medicine. They came to see the garden, to stand on the terraces and look out over the valley and try to understand how this barren ridge, this place they had called the dead man's grave, had become the most alive place in the county. They came to see the woman who had done it, the woman who had bought a ruin for $50 and turned it into something none of them had the imagination to see. Marin hired Ephraim Pierce to finish the cabin. He came up the ridge with his tools and his family and his quiet, steady competence. And over the course of 3 weeks, he transformed the ruin into a home. A real roof of solid timber sealed tight against the wind. Glass in the windows catching the light. A proper door of oak hung on iron hinges, swinging smooth and true. The great stone hearth, once a symbol of collapse, now anchored the room with warmth and light. The fire burning steady, the blue-green stones arranged on the mantel like a row of sentinels. It was a home, her home, built from the bones of a dead man's dream, finished by the hands of a man whose family she had saved standing on ground that an entire valley had dismissed as worthless. And every stone in the walls, every beam in the roof, every plant in the terraced beds outside carried the same quiet message. The one Lockhart had carved into the wall. The one Nettie Crow had spoken on a dusty street. The one the blue-green stones had been whispering into the soil for decades. The truth is in the stone, not in the soil. One evening, late in the spring, Dr. Hargrove stood on the highest terrace, finalizing an order that would supply clinics in 2 counties. He had been coming here long enough now that he no longer marveled at the garden. He simply worked within it the way a man works within a landscape he has come to trust. But tonight, with the sun going down and the valley spread out below in a quilt of green and gold, something in the light made him stop and look around with fresh eye. The terraces climbed the slope in neat stone steps, each one thick with growing things. The purple sage, the rhodiola, the dozen other species that had no common names, only the Latin designations Lockhart had given them, now supplemented by the practical descriptive names Marin had added in her own hand. Frost flower, stone mint, ridge thyme. Names that came from the place itself, from the wind and the rock, and the daily intimacy of tending things that grew. "You've built something remarkable here, Marin," he said. His voice was quiet in the way that voices become when they are trying to be equal to a moment. More than Lockhart himself managed. More than I would have believed possible when I rode up here for the first time. He paused. "What do you call this place now?" Marin was standing at the edge of the terrace, Solomon beside her. The old mule's coat had thickened for winter and was now shedding in patches, giving him a slightly ridiculous moth-eaten look that she found deeply endearing. He stood with his weight on 3 legs, the 4th cocked and rest his ears turning slowly like satellite dishes, tracking sounds she couldn't hear. The wind moved through his mane. The last light caught the blue-green stones that edged the garden beds, and for a moment they shimmered like something alive. She placed her hand on Solomon's neck. She felt the steady pulse of his blood beneath the coarse hair, the warmth of a living creature who had walked beside her from Kansas to Montana, from grief to purpose, from a failed wheat field to a garden of stone. She thought of Dougal, of his last words. "Don't let the dirt bury you too." She had not. She had climbed above the dirt, above the fertile, treacherous soil that took everything, and she had found her footing on rock. She thought of Phineas Lockhart, alone in this cabin, writing his notes by candlelight, hiding his most important discovery inside a hollow stone. Because he knew that men would kill for it, and that paper could be burned, but stone endured. She thought of Nettie Crow, sitting on a bench in the shade, her dark eyes seeing past the dust and the despair to something that Marin herself could not yet see. "Some roots don't need water, they need stone." She looked out over the valley. The town of Harrow Falls was a scatter of tiny shapes in the distance, its rooftops catching the last light. The people down there were cooking dinner, closing up shops, feeding their horses, living the ordinary lives of ordinary days. Some of them had laughed at her. Some of them had pitied her. Some of them had tried to destroy her. And now some of them depended on her, on the medicine that grew in her garden, on the knowledge that a dead man had left in the ground, and a living woman had been patient enough to find. Dr. Hargrove was still waiting for his answer. Marin looked at the blue-green stones shimmering in the fading light. She looked at the tough, beautiful plants growing from soil that shouldn't have supported a thing. She looked at Solomon, patient, enduring still here after everything. "I didn't build a garden," she said. Her voice was soft, but clear, carrying the full weight of every mile she had traveled,
every stone she had lifted, every night she had spent alone on this ridge listening to the wind. I just learned to listen to the ground. The sun slipped behind the mountains. The sky turned the color of deep water. The wind moved through the garden carrying the scent of sage and stone and the quiet, persistent miracle of things that grow where nothing should. Solomon let out a long, slow breath through his nostrils. The sound of an animal at rest. The sound of a day completed. The sound, if you listened closely enough, of the earth itself exhaling.